This is daily success.
Bill Gates was a young boy. He was only 13 years old. He discovered something truly amazing. It was a computer terminal, a gateway to a new world. This was at his school, the Lakeside Prep School in Seattle. The year was 1968. In those days, computers were enormous machines. They were incredibly expensive. Very few people had ever seen one, let alone used one. But Bill was different. He was intensely curious. He felt an immediate pull to understand how this complex machine worked. He sensed that this machine held a special kind of magic, a power he wanted to unlock. The school had a teletype Model 33 machine. This was not a computer itself, it was a terminal. It connected over phone lines to a much larger General Electric computer. Bill found himself completely captivated. He would spend countless hours in the small computer room. He eagerly read every manual he could find. He started to learn a new language, a computer language. This language was called BASIC. BASIC stood for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. It was designed to be relatively simple for beginners to learn. Bill adored the logic of it. He loved the intellectual challenge of making the computer follow his commands. He was, quite simply, hooked. His very first computer program was a simple one. He decided to write a game of tic-tac-toe. He programmed it using the basic language he was learning. The game allowed a person to play against the computer. Imagine the incredible thrill for a young teenager, a young boy, barely a teenager, giving instructions to a giant impersonal machine. And the machine listened. The machine responded. This was a taste of real power. It was an act of creation. Bill began to see the immense potential locked within these machines. He saw what software, the programs he was writing, could actually do. It was much more than just a game to him. It was a window into the future. This early start in programming was profoundly important. It planted a tiny seed in his mind. This seed was a deep passion for software and for programming. Bill was not just idly playing around with the school's terminal. He was actively learning. He was constantly exploring new possibilities. He was thinking, really thinking, about what the future might hold. He had a strong feeling, an intuition, that this future would be filled with computers. And all these computers, big and small, would need software to make them useful. His incredible journey into the world of technology had just begun. It was a journey that would eventually change the world in ways no one then could imagine. Bill Gates was not alone on his early journey. He soon found a friend who shared his deep passion. This friend was Paul Allen. Paul was a couple of years older than Bill. He also attended Lakeside School. Paul was just as fascinated by computers as Bill was. They met in the school's computer room. It was a small, often crowded space, but for them, it was a place of endless discovery. They would spend hours there together. They talked about computers. They talked about programming. They dreamed about what these machines could do. Their friendship was forged in lines of code. Paul Allen was very smart. He knew a lot about hardware, the physical parts of computers. Bill was more focused on software, the programs that made computers work. Together, they made a great team. They balanced each other's strengths. Paul could understand the intricate workings of the machines. Bill could create the elegant logic of the software. They started working on projects together. They pushed each other to learn more. They challenged each other to think bigger. This partnership would become one of the most important in the history of technology. It was a meeting of two brilliant minds. They were both driven by a restless energy. They wanted to do more than just use the school's computer time. They wanted to explore the limits of what was possible. They found ways to get more computer time. Sometimes this meant getting up in the middle of the night. They would sneak into places that had computers. They were hungry for knowledge. They were hungry for experience. They believed that computers were not just for big companies or scientists. They believed computers could be for everyone. This was a radical idea at the time. Their shared vision started to take shape. It was a vision of a world where computers were personal, a world where software made these computers powerful and easy to use. This was long before most people could even imagine owning a computer, but Bill and Paul saw it clearly. Their early collaboration was more than just a hobby. It was the beginning of a mission to bring computing power to the masses. Their journey together was just starting, but the destination was already in their sights, however distant it seemed. They were ready to build the future. The Lakeside School computer room became their laboratory. It was a place of intense learning and experimentation. Bill Gates and Paul Allen spent nearly all their free time there. They devoured computer manuals like novels. They learned different programming languages. They weren't just completing assignments, they were pushing the boundaries of their knowledge. They tackled complex problems. They wrote sophisticated programs. The teletype machine clattered away, printing out their code line by line. Each line was a step forward in their understanding. Each successful program was a small victory. They didn't just learn from books. They learned by doing. They learned from their mistakes. Programming back then was a difficult process. There were no fancy screens or helpful error messages like today. They had to be meticulous. They had to be patient. A single misplaced comma could ruin hours of work, but they persevered. They debugged their programs with determination. This early experience taught them discipline. It taught them the importance of careful thinking. These were skills that would prove invaluable later in their careers. The challenges only made them more determined. One of their early projects at Lakeside was ambitious. The school asked them to create a computerized class scheduling system. This was a real-world problem. It was complex. It involved many variables and constraints. Bill and Paul eagerly took on the challenge. Bill even found a way to tweak the program. He made sure he was scheduled into classes with interesting girls. It showed his playful side. But it also showed his ability to make software do exactly what he wanted. The project was a success. It demonstrated their growing skills. It showed they could build useful software. These experiences at Lakeside were crucial. They were not just about learning to code. They were about learning how to solve problems. They were about learning how to work together. They were about seeing the power of software to transform tasks. The computer room was more than just a room with a machine. It was a training ground. It was a place where their passion grew stronger every day. Bill and Paul were no longer just students. They were becoming true programmers. They were becoming innovators. They were getting ready for bigger things. As Bill Gates and Paul Allen grew more confident in their programming skills, they started to look for opportunities beyond their school projects. They wanted to apply their knowledge to real-world business problems. They were young, but they were ambitious. They believed they could create software that people would pay for. This was a bold step for teenagers in the early 1970s. The idea of selling software was still very new. Most software was custom-made for large companies that owned mainframe computers. But Bill and Paul saw a different path. Their first real business venture was a company they called Trafo Data. The name itself was descriptive. It was about traffic data. Paul Allen had learned about a new technology. It involved using rubber hoses laid across roads. These hoses were connected to a counter. When cars drove over the hoses, the counter would record the traffic flow. The problem was that the data was collected on paper tapes. These tapes had to be manually read and analyzed. This process was slow and tedious. Bill and Paul saw an opportunity to automate it. They decided to build a small computer. This computer would read the data from the paper tapes automatically. It would then process this data and generate reports for traffic engineers. Their plan was to use an Intel 8008 microprocessor. This was one of the very first microprocessors available. It was a tiny chip, but it had the power to run their program. Building the hardware was a challenge. Paul Allen, with his interest in hardware, took the lead on this part. Bill Gates focused on writing the software that would analyze the traffic counts. It was a true partnership. The idea behind Trafo Data was clever. It addressed a real need. Cities and transportation departments needed traffic data to plan roads and signals. If Bill and Paul could provide this data more quickly and efficiently, they could have a successful business. They were betting on the power of data. They were betting on the power of automation. They were still in high school, but they were acting like entrepreneurs. They were taking risks. They were trying to build something new. Trafo Data was their first serious attempt to turn their passion for programming into a real business. Section 5. Rough Roads, Real Lessons, the Trafo Data Trial. The journey of Trafo Data was not smooth. Bill Gates and Paul Allen faced many challenges. Building their custom computer was harder than they expected. The Intel 8008 microprocessor was new. It was also quite limited in its capabilities. They had to work within tight constraints. Debugging the hardware was a frustrating process. Sometimes the machine just wouldn't work. They spent many long nights trying to figure out the problems. It was a test of their persistence. But they didn't give up easily. They were determined to make their idea a reality. When they finally had a working prototype, they tried to sell their service. They approached local government agencies. They offered to process traffic data for a fee. They even managed to get some customers. The city of Seattle was one of them. They processed traffic tapes and generated reports. They earned some money from trafo data. It wasn't a huge amount, it certainly wasn't enough to make them rich, but it was their first real income from a software and hardware venture. It proved that their skills had commercial value. This was an important validation for the young entrepreneurs. However, trafo data ultimately did not become a big success. The business had its flaws. Sometimes their machine didn't work perfectly when they demonstrated it to potential clients. This was embarrassing. It hurt their credibility. The market for their specific service was also quite small. They learned that having a good idea and technical skills was not enough. They also needed business acumen. They needed marketing skills. They needed a bit of luck. The trafo data experience was a tough but valuable lesson in the realities of business. Despite its limited financial success, trafo data was incredibly important. It taught Bill and Paul many valuable lessons. They learned about hardware development. They learned about software development for a specific purpose. They learned about working with clients. They learned about the challenges of starting a business. These lessons were far more valuable than the money they earned. Trafo data was a stepping stone. It prepared them for their next big adventure. It strengthened their partnership. It fueled their desire to succeed on a larger scale. The road was rough, but the lessons were real. Section 6. The little box that could Altair's arrival. In December 1974, something exciting happened. Paul Allen saw an article in a magazine. The magazine was called Popular Electronics. The cover featured a new computer. It was called the Altair 8800. This was not a giant mainframe computer. It was a microcomputer. It was a kit that people could buy and assemble themselves. It cost only a few $100s. This was revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary people, hobbyists, could own their own computer. It was a small box, but it held enormous potential. Paul Allen knew this was a big deal. He rushed to show the magazine to Bill Gates. Bill was then a student at Harvard University. They both immediately understood the significance of the Altair 8800. This little machine could change everything. But there was a problem. The Altair 8800 was just a box of parts and switches. It didn't have any useful software. To make it truly powerful, it needed a programming language. It needed a way for users to write their own programs. Bill and Paul knew what language it needed. It needed BASIC. The same language they had learned at Lakeside School. The Altair 8800 was created by a small company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The company was called MITS, which stood for Micro-Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. Its founder was Ed Roberts. Roberts was taking a huge gamble with the Altair. He hoped to sell a few hundred kits to electronics enthusiasts. He probably didn't realize he was about to ignite a revolution. The Altair was a blank slate. It was waiting for software to bring it to life. Bill Gates and Paul Allen saw their chance. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They believed that if the Altair had BASIC, it would become much more popular. People wouldn't just build the kit, they would be able to program it. They could write games, they could write useful applications. It would transform the Altair from a hobbyist toy into a real personal computer. This was a bold vision. But Bill and Paul were convinced they could do it. They had the skills. They had the passion. They decided to contact Ed Roberts at MITS. They would offer to write a BASIC interpreter for his Altair 8800. It was a daring move. Section 7. Basic Instinct Crafting Code for a Revolution. The decision to write BASIC for the Altair 8800 was a huge risk. Bill Gates and Paul Allen didn't actually have an Altair computer to work on. They had only seen pictures of it in the magazine. They didn't even have the Intel 8080 microprocessor that powered the Altair. But that didn't stop them. They were driven by an incredible sense of urgency. They knew that others would soon realize the need for software for the Altair. They had to be first. This was their chance to make a real impact, their chance to be part of something big. Paul Allen started working on an emulator program. This was a clever piece of software. It would make a larger PDP-10 computer at Harvard behave like the Altair's 8080 chip. This way they could write and test their BASIC code even without the real hardware. It was a brilliant workaround. Bill Gates focused on writing the BASIC interpreter itself. He worked day and night. He was completely absorbed in the project. He slept little. He ate at his keyboard. He was fueled by coffee and an intense determination to succeed. He had to fit all of BASIC into the Altair's very limited memory. They worked for about 8 frantic weeks. It was an incredible feat of programming. Bill poured all his skill and concentration into the code. He had to make it small. He had to make it efficient. He had to make it work perfectly. The pressure was immense. They had promised MIT's a working BASIC. If they failed, their credibility would be shattered. But Bill was in his element. He loved the challenge. He loved the process of crafting elegant code. He was building the software that would unlock the power of the personal computer. Finally, their BASIC interpreter was ready. Paul Allen flew to Albuquerque to demonstrate it to Ed Roberts at MITS. He carried the precious code on a paper tape. He was nervous. What if it didn't work? He had never run it on a real Altair before. He carefully loaded the paper tape into the Altair. Everyone held their breath. Then, the teletype connected to the Altair clattered to life. It printed memory size. Paul typed in a number. Then, the crucial moment, it printed ready. Their BASIC worked. It was a moment of triumph. A moment that would change the history of computing. Section 8, 1,000 Pixels of Promise, the first big sale. When Paul Allen successfully demonstrated their BASIC interpreter on the Altair 8800 at MITS, it was a breakthrough. Ed Roberts was impressed. He knew that this software would make his computer vastly more appealing to customers. He agreed to license their BASIC. MITS would pay them for every copy of Altair BASIC that was sold. This was the deal Bill Gates and Paul Allen had dreamed of. Their hard work, their sleepless nights, their daring gamble, it had all paid off. They had created a valuable piece of software. And now, they were going to get paid for it. This was their first truly significant commercial success. While Trafo Data had brought in some money, this was different. This was bigger. The initial payments from MITS started to come in. It wasn't millions of dollars at first, but it was real money. It was the reward for their innovation and their effort. It was more than just the money itself, it was the validation. It proved that their vision of software as a product was viable. They could write code, and people would pay for it. This was the foundation of a new kind of business, the personal computer software business. With this success, Bill Gates made a monumental decision. He decided to leave Harvard University. He was only a sophomore. But he saw the incredible opportunity in front of him. The personal computer revolution was just beginning. He wanted to be at the heart of it. Paul Allen also quit his job. Together they moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico to be closer to MITS. In 1975, they officially formed their own company. They called it Microsoft. The name combined microcomputer and software. It perfectly described their focus. Their journey as entrepreneurs had truly begun. Their initial earnings from Altair BASIC were modest by today's standards, but for two young programmers, it was a significant start. It gave them the capital and the confidence to grow their new company. They weren't just hobbyists anymore, they were businessmen. They were pioneers in a brand new industry. The sale of BASIC for the Altair 8800 was the pivotal moment. It was their first major step towards building what would become a global technology giant. That first income, earned from their ingenuity and hard work, fueled their dreams and set them on the path to incredible success. Section 9. From Garage Dreams to Global Reach, the Microsoft Genesis. The success with Altair BASIC was just the beginning for Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Their company, Microsoft, soon to be Microsoft, was born out of this initial triumph. They didn't rest on their laurels. They knew that the Altair 8800 was just one computer. Many other companies would soon start building their own microcomputers. And all these new machines would also need software. They would all need BASIC. Bill and Paul saw a huge market opening up. Their vision expanded beyond just one machine. They aimed to provide software for every computer. They worked tirelessly to adapt their BASIC interpreter for other microprocessors and other computer systems. Companies like Apple, Commodore, and Tandy Radio Shack were emerging. Each new computer was a potential customer for Microsoft's BASIC. Bill Gates took on the role of lead negotiator. He was tenacious, he was focused. He believed deeply in the value of their software. He made deals. He licensed their BASIC to many different manufacturers. This strategy was brilliant. It established Microsoft's BASIC as the industry standard. It put their software into the hands of millions of early computer users. The early earnings from these ventures, while initially modest, were reinvested into the company. They hired more programmers, they developed new software products. They were building more than just BASIC. They were building a software company, a company that would create operating systems, applications, and programming tools. The foundation laid by Trafo Data and Altair BASIC was crucial. Those early projects taught them about technology, about business, and about perseverance. They learned how to identify opportunities. They learned how to take calculated risks. They learned how to build a team. The journey from those first lines of code at Lakeside School to the Trafo data venture to the creation of Altair Basic was a remarkable one. It was a story of curiosity, passion, and hard work. Bill Gates and Paul Allen had a vision. They believed in the power of personal computing. They believed that software was the key to unlocking that power. Their early modest earnings were the seeds from which Microsoft grew. Their perseverance in the face of challenges, their ability to seize opportunities, and their unwavering belief in their vision paved the way for one of the most successful companies in the world. Their story continues to inspire aspiring programmers and entrepreneurs everywhere.